once told me, she's now the chairman of the Public Service Commission. She used to be teaching at the university. She told me, she did a lot of mediation, she told me that mediation even works in the criminal arena. So no holds barred, and I recommend to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senior, for that wonderful address. And Senior's asked to be excused because he has to keep a commitment elsewhere, which apparently does not have to do with mediation, but possibly is more in line with his more traditional practice. So he's asked to be excused. I think that he's reminded us of a number of important features of mediation that we're really marking as we seek to elaborate further upon the theme that we have before us as mediation as a pathway to peace. And in addition to reminding us about the famous saying of Mahatma Gandhi, it also reminded me of a very famous saying, I believe, by Ambrose Bierce, who once said, and hopefully this wouldn't cause anyone an offense, said litigation is a process where you enter as a pig and you emerge as a sausage. So to the extent to which that may still be true, perhaps we need to be more mindful of the importance of mediation. I'd like to move fairly swiftly on to our second distinguished speaker. And he's none other than the Honorable Minister for Legal Affairs, Mr. Prakash Ramadar. He entered the legal fraternity some 25 years ago and has excelled, particularly in the criminal field, as one of Trinidad and Tobago's most respected attorneys at law. He's developed a reputation, I think, both as a minister as well as in practice as a no-nonsense person, no-nonsense lawyer also, who's prepared to challenge the establishment whenever the situation demands it. He's also adamant, I'm authorized to say, that politics must never be about politicians or about their self-interest, and holds firmly to the view that politics must be about, ultimately, the people whom the politicians serve. His is an example of how politicians should conduct themselves in public life, and by his work, he exemplifies the nobility of politics and its effectiveness as a tool in achieving national development. I might add that as a minister, I think he's also been responsible for a number of innovative developments at the ministry, particularly in the sort of IT field, which I think has really made the services of the ministry accessible to the general public. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome the distinguished Minister of Legal Affairs, Mr. Prakash Ramadar.
Good morning to each and every one of your noble souls gathered here today. I, unlike learned Senior, did not prepare a script, because when I learned of the theme of these very important sessions, I knew I had to speak from what I truly believe from deep within. And I'm moved now this morning to probably quote from the Bible that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth. And I make this statement unashamedly knowing that in this room are persons and souls guarded for the higher purpose of man's existence, which is to bring peace and at the end of it, happiness to our brothers and sisters in Trinidad and Tobago and indeed the world. Why do I say this? Over the weekend I had a few moments and I was able to look at a program dealing with the Second World War and the First World War. I was reflected upon that it was a 31-year war. There weren't two world wars, there was one. One started, as we know it, in the First World War and then continued itself into the Second. Now, I shan't go into what caused the First World War, but in that program, it was made obvious that when the the Axis powers were defeated, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. But at that signing of this treaty, the triumphant powers laid down their law and they gave it to the German people. A bargain or in fact an edict, that they could not tolerate and they could not bear, although they signed. As a result of which, tremendous burdens were put, and I'm not defending the German nation, but tremendous burdens were put on them that made it impossible to carry on as a self-respecting nation of pride and honor. There was great suffering because they had put a charge on the Germans of $80 billion, some $500 billion in today's value. As a result of which there was massive unemployment and a hate and a vengeance for those who they felt had defeated them and oppressed them. And I don't know if Brian Davidine is in the room here today, our industrial court judge, but in our many conversations over the years, he had told me something that remains with me, that vengeance is a dish best served cold. And in the German heart was an effort to ensure that vengeance was theirs. And they built their war machine, and the long and short of it is, during those two world wars, 100 million souls perished. And I am now reminded when Albert Einstein reflected that peace is not by the enforcement of power, but by understanding. So on the largest of scales, we need to reassess ourselves as humanity as to how we resolve conflicts. Because Mahatma Gandhi was absolutely correct. But Leonard Senior, he didn't say half the world will go blind, but that all of the world will go blind if we were to take an eye for an eye. And it's about time that luckily we have not all gone blind. And those with a vision here today will now move to that new paradigm as to how we deal with our brothers and our sisters and create a whole new shift to the reconciliation of relationships and of rights and of duties. And if we don't do that now, we could very well end up in societies, and we have the great honor to have the Chief Justice of Rwanda here, a society that almost decimated itself for foolish things that we could stand here and describe as foolish, but in them being in that moment of misconceived positions, anger and vengeance was allowed to go unrelentingly, and we saw what happened to that society. Trinidad is nowhere near that. But nor are we immune from the possibilities of an awful future if we do not take check of our reality today. Because cancers do not begin and end in one fell swoop. It can begin in one point and extend itself throughout. And we've seen some very unhealthy developments in the last several decades in Trinidad and Tobago, where race and culture, once our greatest strengths, are now identified by some for their own selfish purposes for issues of division and discrimination. And it is important that we take that first step. And I want to congratulate Justice Kokoram and others who have taken the responsibility, because many can speak about things, but few are willing to take the step to make something happen. And this event here is but one step further to a better resolution of things. I see Senior Counsel Jairam is just leaving, but there's a story I always tell. Mr. Jairam represented my father in a trial that I had filed as a student some 26 years ago. And earlier this year, the Court of Appeal sent it back for retrial. And it was a case where a relative of my father's, of myself, had owed him money. And he had fallen into some financial problems and claimed he could not repay. After many efforts to retrieve some satisfaction, even a promise to pay, we had no choice but to resort to the court. But the quality of lawyer that he retained told us one thing: he could not be bankrupt, he could not be broke. And that battle went on for 26 years, at the end of which my father, in ill health, we decided, look, it's about time we brought this matter to a close. And we did. And my father died this year. At his funeral, however, the defendant came and wept and asked for forgiveness. And that is the one thing that we had always wanted, but it was too late. And that is why it is so important for us to recognize that relationships are so important, and the courts is not the best place. Sometimes it's the only place, but it must be the last resort and not the first option. And this is so important that we take cognizance of the fact that we need to make the society a happier, better place in our own families, in our own communities, and throughout the length and breadth. And to that end, talking about things that we need to do, just last week we were able to hand out certificates of appointment to clerks of the peace, members of the business community, and from the regional corporations to infiltrate and to infect in the ground a whole new licensing regime. In the old days, liquor license applications, you would have to go to court, and if there are objections, you have to do it as a trial. We have now institutionalized a form of mediation as a first option where there are objections to liquor licenses. And there are many other things. I'm now given the great fortune to lead the National Center for Dispute Resolution. And it's our intent, and we've started the work now, to get office space in every regional corporation to establish an office for conflicts within government and to extend it between government employees and members of the public. So I'm seeing now all this effort coming together. As they say, a rising tide will raise all boats. And I think the time is now. The place is here for us to put our shoulders to the wheel to ensure that the mighty effort that is required to change the way we think about conflict resolution is at hand. And I feel extremely optimistic. I feel lifted and empowered by the work that each and every one of you would have contributed to, and the great work that we must commit ourselves to into the future. So my friends, we have a tremendous task ahead, but a critically important one. And together we can do it. There is nothing called impossible in today's world, unless, of course, we believe it to be so. I believe in the possible. I believe in the now. And I believe that what we all do reflects directly on the golden rule that we all grew up with, that to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So that at the end of any conflict, if you understand that, you must understand how the other person, how the other party feels. And feelings are critically important. And we will do on our part to ensure that they feel soothed and satisfied, because they truly are our brothers. And we are truly their keeper. Then I think that we'll be doing God's work. God bless you all.
Transformation, peace, and harmony is our priority. Yeah. Mediation time.
Could we have another round of applause for the Honourable Minister? And of course, we thank you very much for taking the time from, we know, is I'm sure an extremely busy schedule to be with us and to share those thoughts. I believe the Minister's address has really pointed us in many ways in the right direction, because not only in terms of sharing a very personal story, which of course impacted in a very direct way on his own family, but also in terms of the dimensions brought about through international mediation, the significance of certain peacemakers that are well known on the international horizon, such as His Holiness the Pope, certainly the UN Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan, is also renowned as a mediator, and we've had requests for intervention in some of the neighboring countries. I think the papacy was invited to assist Venezuela in some of the struggles that it has been going through on a domestic front. And of course, we understand too the impact of the Cold War, as well as many others adversely affected by the ravages of war. So we're very grateful for these timely reminders that I think hopefully would point us in the direction of considering what further reforms are needed to our own domestic legislation. Speaking of that, I think one of the things that we often observe in other jurisdictions, Canada I think being one of them, is the presence on the statute books of something called an Apology Act. As I understand it, while we don't have that here, it's something that perhaps we need to think about, because it doesn't of course, necessarily hold any particular institution or so to blame, but it does allow some healing to take place, particularly where someone, unfortunately, may have died in tragic circumstances at a public institution, such as a hospital or so. So maybe that is something that we need to think about very seriously. Now, without further ado, because I know time is getting on, we have, of course, following in the wake of Chief Justice Rugege yesterday, the feature address to be given today by Deputy Judge Mr. Louis Resnick, who is a mediation arbitrator with the ADR Chambers in Toronto. Now, you have his bio sketch, which I'm sure is probably not as elaborate as it could be, in your booklets. So I just want to highlight one or two aspects of it. In addition to being a mediator and arbitrator, as well as a deputy judge, he's also certified by the Law Society of Upper Canada as a specialist in civil litigation, so indeed he embraces all levels within the judicial system. And he has been involved in terms of pre-hearing arbitrators, rendering some assistance, particularly in the area of insurance. And in particular, he has been very involved too as a continuing instructor and coach at the Osgoode Hall Law School, which we know is a very distinguished law school, as well as pioneering this course in theory and practice of mediation. And indeed, we want to underline the importance of theory to mediation, something that perhaps isn't always picked up upon by the practical courses that are offered. And theory, I think we have to understand, is extremely important. So we're very delighted to have him in our midst, and I can share on a personal note that I had the great privilege of